Liberal MP Jason Falinski, and also the Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Andrew Giles. Welcome to both of you. Let's just start on some of these big stories today, particularly this news about the winding down of some of these restrictions in Queensland, in WA, and also now in Victoria. There's a resistance really to calls from the Federal Education Minister to reopen schools. Andrew Giles, do you want to see students return to classrooms before the end of the term?
Look, as a parent of primary school students, what I want is for advice to be followed, the right advice. I'm very comfortable with the arrangements that are in Victoria at the moment. Whether my kids are getting the same quality of teaching from me at home as they would be getting in a classroom setting is a different question. But no, I'm very comfortable with the approach the Victorian government's taking at the moment. And clearly in different states there'll be different issues that those education ministers and departments will be working through on advice, I'd imagine, from their own chief medical officers. I think they're much better placed than the federal minister to make those decisions. OK, but the federal minister, to be fair, says he's relying on the medical advice from his panel and the chief medical officer. This isn't advice that the government's coming up with on its own. Do you accept that? Well, I'm sure that's right, but we've also heard.
Well, if it's right, that's the advice, isn't it?
Well, but we've also heard the advice from Brett Sutton, the Chief Medical Officer in Victoria, which strikes a slightly different note. And I guess, Patricia, there are a few other issues here, aren't there? I mean, I understand there's about 1 million school children in Victoria. One of the things that's been really striking about this is the way in which Australians have come together and managed social distancing. I think we've all got to think about the implications of, well, 2 million more movements in Victoria alone a day, as we seek to avoid a second wave of infections, as we try and manage our way through this crisis, whilst also, of course, making sure our kids get the education they deserve.
Jason, Queensland and WA are winding back their restrictions. Do you want your home state of New South Wales to do this too?
Oh, look, I think well, Queensland and Western Australia went a lot further than New South Wales did initially, so that gave both those states an opportunity to wind those restrictions back. Clearly, New South Wales and Victoria have been hit harder by this virus than Queensland and Western Australia has, so that has afforded them the opportunity to wind back those restrictions sooner. But look, I think all of us want Australia back up and running as quickly as possible without putting the lives and health of any Australians at risk. It is important that these decisions are made locally and that they take into account the local context of that occurring.
We see people flocking to Sydney beaches, though. Are you worried people are becoming complacent?
Yes, I am, and I've got to say that that's very disappointing. Look, in this particular instance, I've really been very unhappy with the behaviour of councils in Sydney. I think that they have mismanaged, by and large, our public spaces. And in doing so, when they close Bondi, I mean, I'm from the Northern Beaches in Sydney, what they create is a compounding, cascading set of closures across all beaches. Because once you close one beach, people move to the next beach, and then the one after, and the one after that. And before you know it, you're closing every beach in Sydney. And at a time when we need to make sure that we manage our public spaces as best as possible and that they're available to people who are otherwise stuck in their homes for exercise and fresh air and, frankly, ensuring that their mental health stays the same. We have relied on the third tier of government, being councils, to manage those public spaces, and I'm afraid to say that certainly in New South Wales, they, in many cases, have not been up to the task at hand.
What did you think they should have done? Are you sort of suggesting coordination? Because, yeah, you're right, there's a flow on, other beaches are open, there are ramifications to every decision. How could they have done it better?
Well, in economic literature, this is called the tragedy of the commons. That is where you have public spaces that get overused by everyone. It is important in these particular instances that you make sure that public spaces are rationed appropriately and properly. I think too many councils in the Sydney Basin, at the very least, threw their hands up and just said, oh, we can't actually manage this at all. And so the result of that was that the state government had to send in the police and just close the whole thing down. That was immensely disappointing. Whereas if they'd simply been managed properly, my experience has been that when people are in the first instance, explain to them why we are doing social distancing, what the rules entail and what that means that they have to do, 99.9% of people comply. When there is non-compliance, it's usually due to confusion or because they didn't understand or they were unaware. Councils had a very specific opportunity during this period to actually show us that they could manage the public spaces which they hold in trust, and in many instances they simply failed to do so, and that has been, I think, a matter of grave disappointment. And when this is all over, it's something I think that that in New South Wales at least will need to be reviewed.
Andrew Giles, I know you're a Victorian MP, but of course this is a national issue for us as well as an international one. Do you agree with that critique, that at the sort of localised level there has been a mismanagement?
Look, I can't really comment on what's been happening at the Sydney beaches and the role of local government there. But I guess what I can say is that we can all try and be clearer about what we're trying to achieve. And I think that was at the core of much of what Jason was saying. I think at the outset we saw from the government some mixed messages, the federal government that is. But I think what we've all been trying to do, and certainly what we've been trying to do in the Labor opposition, is to show constructive advice to the Australian community about how to get through this period of social distance. That's an obligation that's on those of us in federal politics, on state politics, and on people in local government. As Jason says, I think most Australians, we've seen this, most Australians have been determined to do the right thing. What we can do as people who hold positions of trust in community and in politics is to try and be clearer about making sure that they have the best information before them about what's the right thing to do.
Now, this app seems to have been a lot more successful than I think if you sort of rewinded to our conversations just a week ago. There was the view that many Australians might be concerned about their privacy, and yet by the end of today, the Chief Medical Officer suggests we could have 2 million Australians who have signed up to this new coronavirus tracing app. It's pretty extraordinary. Jason, why do you think that is? Is it sort of a rush to take off the restrictions, which is what's essentially been promised here? Are people willing to forfeit, I suppose, a sense of privacy because of that rush?
Well, look, can I firstly start off by saying that I really want to congratulate a number of business leaders in this whole process, from supermarkets, people who work at the supermarkets, who've made sure that we've, had reliable access to food and not had the worries that many other countries have had. And today we've seen Mike Cannon-Brookes, probably one of our most successful IT entrepreneurs and tech entrepreneurs, say to the business community, it's time for us to step up and explain to people who may not have the technical proficiency to understand that this app is safe. So I want to thank Mike for doing that, and the other business leaders who've shown leadership during this process. I think most Australians understand that in downloading this app, it's not about them, it's about their families, about their friends, about their communities, and protecting all of Australia, and allowing health authorities rather to track people where the disease is getting spread or not getting spread. So it is actually it's for the common good. And at this time, I think Australians have come together quite well. We've had a shared sense of sacrifice. And I agree with you, Patricia, this has been about people making the trade-off of, yes, if I download this app, which is perfectly safe and the privacy is guaranteed, then there is the opportunity for us to get back to work and get back to our normal lives sooner rather than later. But I think the fundamental thing is that it keeps our community safer.
Andrew Giles, it seems today Labor politicians, including Bill Shorten, who we spoke to just recently, have been out sort of, making some points about the app, but certainly saying they've signed up. I imagine you've signed up?
Yeah, I did so last night, Patricia. And look, I think all of my colleagues are signing up. There are some issues that I think need to be worked through around privacy, and there will be an opportunity to do that. But look, I just echo Jason's comments on this. I think the vast majority of Australians want to keep doing the right thing. They want to keep themselves safe, but more importantly, their neighbours, their family, their friends, and they want to enable us to get to a position where we can return to something that looks like life as it was. And the app is a small but critical step in doing that. So I was very pleased to download the app, and I will pay attention to the issues down the track because, privacy matters. We live in a time that's been described as a period of surveillance capitalism where our data is a real commodity. So there are some significant issues here, but we can and will work through them down the track. I was very happy to download the app last night.
Look, there's some breaking news this afternoon of a story we reported on that was significant and at the time, so it's really worth putting this to both of you. Tasmanian police have dismissed allegations that healthcare workers from the state's northwest held an illegal dinner party that contributed to the spread of coronavirus in the region. You'll recall reports that there may have been an illegal dinner party and that's how this spread. The Acting Deputy Commissioner, Jonathan Higgins, says an investigation determined that there is no evidence of such a gathering occurring after the relevant directions by the Director of Public Health. So that's just broken this afternoon. Starting with you, Jason Falinski, it was, of course, the Chief Medical Officer that was quoted in a meeting, I think, where he said that he thinks this may have been the reason that this happened. Does it demonstrate we have to be a lot more careful about making these kinds of allegations?
Well, look, firstly, can I say I'm actually gratified that that has now been dismissed, and it's good to know, not that we had any doubt, but it's good to know that healthcare workers are doing the right thing. So I'm glad that that allegation has been put to bed. In defence of Brendan Murphy, he made a comment in a meeting of peers, I believe, New Zealand health officials. I'm not sure that he was aware, though. He probably should have been aware that every mic is a hot mic. And he made an aside comment, which of course went viral. I don't know this for sure, but I suspect if he knew that that comment was going to be repeated elsewhere and that was being made publicly, he probably would not have done that. But look, once again, I'm very glad to hear that that has now been put to bed and we know the truth of the matter, and that's a positive thing. Yeah,
that's right. I'll give you a chance to comment on that too, Andrew Giles, because it was actually a significant story that this potentially illegal dinner party may have been held, and now police say there's no evidence that that happened.
Yeah, it was. And look, I mean, I think this is just a salutary example of how we do need to be very, very careful about what we say. I mean, no criticism of the Chief Medical Officer, but I just think we are in extraordinary times where people are desperate for information, particularly for information of this nature in a community like northwest Tasmania, where there was such a shocking rate of transmission. And I think we've also got to be conscious, when you look at the people who may have been affected, I think everyone appreciates the extraordinary work our frontline medical staff, doctors, nurses and allied health workers are doing at the moment. We've also seen the pressure they're under, the pressure doing their job under difficult circumstances, but also some of the treatment they've been subjected to. And maybe that's an opportunity for all of us in public life to reflect on the words that we use and to be very, very careful in how we communicate to the public about these really significant issues.
Let's just talk, before I let you both go, about some comments that have been reported from the Chinese ambassador. China has warned of a possible economic backlash against Australia if the Morrison government continues to lobby world leaders for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, which is pretty strong comments actually there. Jason Falinski, what's your response to this threat?
Well, look, I mean, I haven't seen those comments, but I'm quite taken aback and surprised, to be honest. I would have thought it would be in the interest of any nation to get to the truth of the matter, what occurred, how it occurred, and why it occurred, and when it occurred, because the critical thing for all of us here is when we know the truth, when we've properly diagnosed the problem, then we can actually go about designing the right solutions. So I would have thought it's in the interest of the Chinese government and the Chinese people to have a proper and full investigation. So I would be, I'm somewhat quizzical about why the ambassador would have said that. Nonetheless, it is important that our organisation, United Nations organisations, have the power, the equipment, the tools they need to undertake their functions. Otherwise, it simply diminishes their role and their capacity, and I think global trust in those institutions. And as we're seeing at the moment, trust in institutions is a critical thing, especially at a time of crisis like the one we're going through at the moment.
Well, Andrew Giles, if we are risking an economic backlash, is it worth it?
Well, look, we do have to get to the bottom of this. That's something that Penny Wong said this morning. We have to do so, I guess, in two critical contexts: our need and the world's need to understand how transmission took place, and also to reset our relationships. And I think that's something that Penny Wong spoke very effectively about in the media this morning. I think it's also incumbent on Australia, as a country which has always been open to the world, to restate our faith in multilateral institutions and to seek to reinforce bodies like the WHO. And I think that's going to be a really critical part of this challenge as well. I also say one other thing, Patricia, and that's that I think it's important that Australians separate criticism of the actions of the Chinese government with criticism of Chinese Australians. I think we've seen some shocking incidences of racism in recent times that I hope all Australian parliamentarians are concerned about. And I hope we can continue to have a debate about the actions that the Chinese state engages in and separate that from unfair racist critique of Chinese Australians.
Yeah, you have been urging the government to implement a kind of strategy to stop virus-related racism, particularly of Asian Australians, as you say. What are you calling for? What do you want them to do specifically?
Well, the first thing that I think the government should do is to reintroduce a national anti-racism campaign, like the Racism It Stops With Me campaign, to show to those who are affected and also to the broad community the harm that racism does and the collective responsibility we have to stand together, particularly at a time like this. But I also think when there are so many signals about racism on the rise and the Human Rights Commission alerting us to the amount of COVID-19 related racism, perhaps it's time for a national strategy to combat racism, to make sure that through this crisis and beyond it, we really are all in together and that individual Australians can't be singled out by reason of where they come from or how they appear.
Thanks to both of you for joining us from your homes and offices.